Bonjour à tous. Je vous remercie.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us for this session 1 at the Aix-en-Provence economic meetings. Our session is called Multilateralism, the end of cooperation and this new era of predation. My name is François Miguet, and I've got 5 people with me for this panel. We have Kitty van der Heijden, who is Under Secretary General and Executive Director General for Partnerships from UNICEF. Clémentine Poilvet-Clédia, who is the Chief Executive of France of the London Stock Exchange. Raphael Tolchman from Jeto Capital, an independent fund for biopharmaceutical companies. We have Professor Henry Huiyu Wang from Beijing, Chair of the Center for China and Globalization. Finally, we have the economist who has coordinated this panel, Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is a professor at Sciences Po in Paris and is a member of a number of think tanks. So I'm going to hand over to Jean to give us a brief introduction, and then we will talk about this fascinating theme of globalization today. Thank you, François. I would like to just give a very brief introduction, and I'd like to start by mentioning 3 key dates in the area that we are starting to experience. The first date is 2008 and the financial crisis, when Western countries lost their reputation for competencies. Until 2008, emerging countries said they might be a little bit unpleasant, unbearable even, but at least they're competent. But from 2008 onwards, the emerging countries realized that that was no longer the case. The second date is the COVID crisis, 2020. This was when the world realized that all of the interdependencies that we had built up, these value chains, were not resilient enough, and that the quest for total efficiency had come at the expense of robustness, resilience, and this was a very significant turning point, because this lesson has not been forgotten. The third key date, which I'd like to mention, is obviously 2022, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which demonstrated that we live in a much more violent world than before, and a world which has every chance of remaining as violent as that. It's a new world that we're living in, and I want to give you a brief analysis from my point of view of what this new world looks like. First of all, the USA is tired of playing the role of global policeman in the world that it had played up till now. With Trump, the states have moved on from being the global policeman to being the global predator, and that's perhaps where the title of this panel session has come from. The question I might ask is this a sustainable position in terms of the predatory attitude? It probably isn't going to be sustainable, but the fact that the USA was tired of the role it was playing in the world, and the fact that the US has decided to change its role, I think that is a lasting change. I think that's a very important first thing to say. The second observation I'd like to make is that China has upturned world trade. I know that's a very obvious thing to say. Currently, China represents 16% of world GDP by value. It represents 22% of GDP in PPP, purchasing power parity, and it accounts for around 30% of manufacturing production. It's no longer possible to imitate or compete with China, and that's been the case since around the turn of the millennium. It's a new world. We live in a multipolar world because this world is no longer dominated by the West. I say a multipolar world because behind China there are other emerging countries who are asking to be part of decision-making processes. So we have to learn to cope with this multipolar world. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And my final point is to say that with all of that, the world's common goods are still around, they're still with us, and we're reminded of it in many different ways. The most recent example of this is the heat wave we've just lived through in Northern Europe. This is just one example of the range of global struggles that will require multilateral cooperation. So, I've mentioned 3 key dates. I talked about us living in a very different world, and in many ways we need to get to know this new world and get to know how to navigate within it. François Miguet, thank you, Jean, for that very full and global overview. You've got a round of applause for that. I'm going to start with you, Professor Wang. You've come in to join us from Beijing, to join us here in the heat of Aix-en-Provence. Do you share the observations that Professor Pisani-Ferry has shared with us? Do you share this view of America as a global predator? And do you share this view of a different role that China is now playing, a role that concerns some other countries of the world? And in your view, what is the state of multilateralism today?
Thank you, the moderator. Yeah, I tend to agree with Professor John's comments just now. I think that as we all know, we're getting into a multipolar world. This has already happened. But what I can see also for the last 81 years since the Bretton Woods system, the globalization still had achieved a great success. For example, our global GDP in dollar term has gone up 40 times, compared with 1949. And the global trade has gone up 400 times almost in the dollar terms. So things still really moving. I think just now John mentioned about financial crisis 2008, talk about pandemic year 20. I was here at this conference in 2022 when China was locked down. We were the only think tank coming out of China to attend this conference. Of course, now we have the war going on, not only just Ukraine, but also Iran and all the many places now. So the war is really getting into a fragmented, more really, and out of people's surprise, things are really out of control. And then so it's really, I think that we're getting into a multipolar world, and then there's no multilateral system to support that. Not really also very effective unilateralism or polylateralism is still not enough. So what I would say is that U.S. certainly is I remember the Munich Security Conference this year, the report, under destruction. There's a big elephant, getting into China shop. It's knocking down all the Chinese vessels and things like that. So what I think, yes, U.S. is unilateralism is very prevalent, and we see what happened in Latin America. We see what happened in Iran. We see what happened in Venezuela. We really, thinking that the multilateral system, UN system, is not really effective. So what I would envision for the future is that we're getting into a multipolar world. There's really 2 major polos, which is US and China. And of course, there's other polos like European Union, of course, India and Global South and many more. So, but among these 2 major polos, I think there's some progress now because US has realized that it cannot really contain China, and they cannot really afford to have a trade war with China. So President Trump visited Beijing in 2 months ago, and President Xi going to visit the U.S. in 2 months' time. And then there's a really understanding. So from term 1.0 of Trump, strategic rivalry between China and U.S. Now Trump 2.0, they have reached the consensus to achieve strategic stability. So I think this is great. So what I'm thinking is that with these two major polos is really have some balance, have some mutually assured deterrence or mutually assured destruction. Then we may have other polos play major role, like European Union. So I think it's good for other polos not to take sides, but mainly mediate, promoting the relation between China and U.S. And also not really follow the U.S. practice, because the U.S. practice was not working. They have a trade war, have a sanctions, have a unilateralism. So I would think that kind of path European Union probably should avoid. We should really seek dialogue, discussions, and also all the consultations. And that's why I think China and the European Union are really important to safeguard the multilateralism, WTO, WHO, United Nations, UNESCO, you name it. China and the EU has so much in common to safeguard multilateralism. So I think European as one polo should not really take sides. It's no longer China versus West, or West versus the West. It's just, on a merit basis. Whoever is doing well, we side with whoever, So I think in that sense, we need to really make a good, new multipolar world and new multilateral system. And then China, European Union, and United States, Global South, we should all work together. And then support UN, and also reform UN Security Council. I think all those are the things we need to do to safeguard the multilateral system.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur Wang, pour cette...
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, for sharing your vision with us. Before I give the floor to our other speakers, I would like to perhaps give Professor Pisani-Ferry the chance to respond on the role that Europe should play. You opened this discussion, but Jean, what do you think what role should Europe play in this new world? Europe, of course, has an important role to play. Europe is a great power if you take Europe as a whole, but nonetheless, Europe needs to learn to speak the language of power. I do want to respond to what Professor Wang said about China. Today, my view is that China is dominant right across a whole range of products and goods, and this is new. World trade had taught us that each country could specialize in terms of its own competitive comparative advantage, but China seems to refuse this idea of comparative advantage. So I'd quite like to talk about that. China also exercises control over critical materials and uses it in discussions with other countries for leverage. We have seen that it was a very significant form of leverage when the USA decided to waive some of the tariffs that have been put in place against China, because China's response was to say, we're capable of bringing American manufacturing to a halt by stopping our exports of critical raw materials. Those are some key points, but there are perhaps some other points. From a macroeconomic point of view, China's model hasn't changed. China's economic model is focused on exports still. It hasn't managed to, or hasn't wanted to, stimulate internal domestic demand and consumption. I I think this is a significant problem that still needs to be solved. Otherwise, it will lead to disaster. It will lead to confrontation between Europe and China. My final point on this subject is to say that there is potential for significant partnership with China. There is potential for partnerships in terms of fighting climate change. There's potential for partnerships in terms of world governance. Nonetheless, this will require that China understands and responds to these challenges. Thank you very much, Jean Pisani-Ferry. I can see that Professor Wang would like to respond, but we're going to first hear from some of our other speakers before we open up the discussion on this point. I'm going to turn to Raphael Torchman. When we were talking together about this panel discussion ahead of time, you said that in your area, in terms of cutting-edge pharmaceuticals, you are facing pressure both from the United States and from China. So I'd like to tell us how that applies in your industry and what can be the European response. Thank you. Just before I tell you how that works, I want to tell you a few features of the healthcare sector, an economic sector, and I'm very pleased to represent it. I'm a doctor. My background is in hemato-oncology, and I've got 20 years' experience in biotechnologies and medical research. Innovation-driven healthcare is a sector that has seen permanent growth without any cycles, boom and bust bubbles. It's a permanently growing sector, and this growth comes from innovation. These innovations have helped us get out of crises such as COVID, or has given us treatments to 2/3 of known illnesses. So, these therapeutic innovations come from small businesses, biotechnical, biopharmaceutical startups, which are then bought out by big pharmaceutical companies, American or European countries, who sell innovative products, innovative drugs, which 60 or 70% of them come from smaller organizations. These big pharma companies outsource the R&D to small companies in order to fill their portfolio of medical products, because the patents will expire, and when they become generic products, there is a massive drop-off in sales revenue. It's estimated that by 2033, pharma companies will lose up to $400 billion in turnover per year, and this is due to 200 medications. That's the world that I work in. Healthcare, it's a worldwide industry, and we need to cooperate across the world. We need interdependency, and I think that over the next few years we will need to work with the US and with China, both of them. So how does Europe fit into this scenario of dependency or predation? Europe in some ways is under pressure, caught between the US and China. The US represents a very significant share of the market for innovative therapies, more than 50%, but the US only represents 4% of world population, so they've got a hold of this big market because of the higher drug prices, but also because of the capacity for innovation on the US market. So the American companies can exercise leverage or even blackmail in order to get major investments in manufacturing plants and so on. In 2025, there was $400 billion of investments from pharmaceutical companies just to get access to the American market. What about China? China is competitive and is interested in all forms of technology, but in terms of therapeutic innovation, it's probably the last area that is managed to crack. If you remember, in 2021, China's COVID vaccine wasn't any good, but over the last 3 or 4 years, China has finally harvested the fruit of everything that's been invested in medical innovation over the last 20 years from a very specific strategic point of view with a investment framework looking at 2040 to 2050. They've invested, they simplified their regulations, and they've promoted medical research. They go 3 times faster and it's twice as cheap. So 35% of approved innovative medication in 2025 came from Chinese innovation, including in the United States. Predictions suggest that by 2030 this figure will reach 50%. So Chinese innovation is with us and is providing our own medications. So how does Europe get on in that? Rather than being at the same time a victim and an accomplice of this, we need to draw on our assets, our advantages, and make sure that we don't get left behind. If I look at the different chains in the links in the chain of healthcare and innovative research, when we think about innovative drugs, 30% of them come from European R&D. So that's still a significant share. It was 50% 10 years ago, so it has dropped off, but we need to continue investing in European research and development in order to ensure that innovation keeps going on in our continent. That's why I've raised 1.6 billion in euros, including from foreign investors who've understood the opportunity of European research. The second thing that goes along with R&D is AI. Artificial intelligence is used in lots of fields, in particular to healthcare. Progress can be made in terms of accelerating development and commercialization to increase the chances of success, and that's why European stakeholders and French companies such as Dassault Systèmes have chosen to focus on healthcare after airplanes and cars and to focus on digitalization in order to accelerate research in the field. Nonetheless, in Europe, we need to simplify the GDPR regulations and to defragment European data in order to get access to use data with AI and remain competitive. The third key aspect of the value chains are clinical trials, which are used to develop drugs and commercialize them. So we need to continue to carry out clinical trials by assuring access to patients. Clinical trials in Europe are still highly regarded. They're considered to be in the third place, even though Europe has dropped off. China is also driving ahead in clinical trials, and we need to draw inspiration from some of the better countries in Europe, the leading countries like Italy or Germany, where Germany uses the price to incite people and patients to take part in clinical trials, and Poland is ranked 9th in clinical trials because they're very effective and they're cheaper. The fourth element is industrialization. We need plants, manufacturing plants. That is a long-term issue. We need to make sure we're making not just paracetamol, but also innovative products by taking risks and investing in order to remain independent in the production of future drugs. And the key issue, the key hub is capital and investment. It's an issue of sovereignty which will enable us to finance investment funds of at least a value of 1 billion euros in order to ensure we have large, high-quality European research projects in order to remain in control over our innovation. There are funds, some very promising initiatives, such as the European Scale-Up Fund, for example, which includes almost all member states, and that has enabled us to form bigger funding pots. So in this era of predators, it's important that Europe realise that healthcare is not just a cost, it's also about investment, and that together, working together between European countries, working together and investing in R&D, we can achieve the golden triangle. R&D, relative independence, and societal good. Thank you very much.
Merci pour ces
Thank you, Corentine Paul-Veclédier. you look, you have the eye of, you're the eye of finance, looking at this new world, which is maybe more complicated, possibly more brutal. Last week, when you talked about the round table, you said to me that, in fact, there is a will from the states, which is quite legit, to be more self-sufficient. But this, in your domain, could actually clash with reality and lead to results which would be negative for the economy, or at least for growth. Can you tell us more? Yeah. I do recognize a lot of elements about interdependence and the need of scales. You know, we do have similar subjects, so you have to speak in your own language. You have, from the financial viewpoint, you know, to say some things, you know, that the financial markets, financial data and risk management in hundreds of countries. So what we see and what we mentioned together indeed is this major topic of sovereignty. What does it mean? What's the geometry, what the scope, and what are the constraints associated with a concept like that? So back to our discussion, what do I see from multilateralism? Because the position of financial markets is a key position to see the confidence among players. Multilateralism never went better than it is now in terms of exchange and transaction, and quite certain complacency from the financial market. But what has changed is how do we look at the interdependence or the interaction. So a couple of years ago, it meant to be virtuous, positive, you know, global economy. We were supposed to be all more efficient in our own way, you know, and with centers of excellence. Today, interdependency is fragile. It can be turned against you. It's a pressure leverage. It's a coercion leveraging tool. So this is what has changed, in my opinion, for the last 2 years, roughly, because of an American position, but not only, but it will stay longer. Let me give you a more concrete example for the audience. Well, first, it is translated by the technological choices you make, because the control of technological infrastructure, this is where power is to be found today in all domains. You know, what's your data, what's your infrastructure? There's no AI without infrastructure. What is your energy policy? Where are your sources for raw materials, and so on and so forth? So if there is a real European discussion to have, you know, it's about technological infrastructure. So I draw 3 observations quickly. First, we have entered what I call will turn into dependency arsenal. So what it changed the economic viability of companies. We'll see that in finance, and therefore it means that you must have a sovereign policy at the European scale, which means that I don't think there is a return of power. Don't think there is a return of power. I don't think power is going to go anywhere. However, the power use interdependence as a means of coercion. We see this with the AI model, frontier AI. You all read about the Mythos model. I give it to you to protect you from cyber security, and then I pull it out depending on your country. So that's the new world of technological interdependence. So when you're a decision maker, regardless of the domain, you don't think just what is my supplier or partner to be selected, but where is my data? What is the relevant court? Is my contract transborder? My rights, will they be okay tomorrow? What's the perennial dimension of the relation? That was here a couple of years ago, but less than now. So this changes the reality of economies. But all domains, for the job today for decision makers, and Jean said it, is to increase and optimize the efficacy of assets. That's the key KPI. Today, there is another one, which is as important, well, even more, is our ability to preserve decision power. Margins of maneuver, arbitration and options. And this is actually what becomes the new orientation for the management. This is why this tension and predation are materialized in our lives. in order to protect the space for decision freedom and decision making, it becomes, not only the choice. I would go as far as to say that in the current period ahead of us, the new gold is choice, and this is how Europe should think: create choice. I'm sure technological sovereignty is key. This is where power is at stake between the blocs, and there is an active discussion on European technology sovereignty, but it's more preventive. It's like, European regulations and so on and so forth. But this, if you want your players to reach a critical size, to have quantum computing and so on and so forth, and AI to be credible, you may have preference for a while. And China and the US do it. It's not a dirty word, but don't protect them from competition. You've got to be involved in a policy of creation, sovereignty, which does not protects you from delay and void. So it has to be a supply policy. If we have an optic of European sovereignty as an active policy of supply to propose different European choices, well, it's not against openness, but it's the condition of the perennity of the openness of Europe. Thank you. Kitty van der Heugen, you probably have a complementary vision, which is the one of UNICEF. This new world, in fact, where interdependence remain, but it is a world where there are increasing tensions, sometimes clashes. We're talking about the clash in the Strait of Hormuz recently, and each time you see at UNICEF that it has non-measured impacts, and decision makers who are the origin of the measurements did not take into consideration this aspect, especially on children, especially in African countries. Could you tell us more about that?
Sort of a tour of the world, from the political heavyweights to the economic streams and the financial streams, and I'm actually going to take you back to something completely different, but at least as important, and that's the question: what happens to children when cooperation fails? When ceasefires break down, when conflict intensifies, when humanitarian and development funding goes down, when international norms and child rights are being weakened? And I think we know the answer. It's always the children that suffer first and foremost. But the flip side of that is equally true. That children are one of the few things that I think, if governments can agree on nothing else, they can still agree that you shall not harm children. And so it is one of those conveyor belts, if you will, to maintain, to renew, to rebuild collaboration in what is a very fractured world. And why does that matter? Because cooperation, to me, to us at UNICEF, as the UN, is not just the absence of agreement. It's not about disagreement. If there is no cooperation, what happens is that vulnerabilities become a strategic variable. Whether it's rare earth materials, access to finance, or in my case, access to education, to healthcare, to everything children need, it becomes dependent not on needs, not on universal norms that we've agreed upon. It becomes dependent on power dynamics. And then, of course, children, they don't have the economic leverage that you guys have, or the political influence that we were speaking about. They are literally the sitting duck. And then if you look at history, which is what I do when I get depressed and anxious about the state of the world, the biggest successes that we've collaboratively ensured were projects of cooperation. Look at the arms treaties, look at the trade domain, look at what happened with halving child mortality, look at the protection that we're offering to refugees. We can actually do that. And it never happened in times of stability and security. All of these processes actually began when the world was in turmoil, when there was lots of insecurity. The UN was formed on the ashes of the Second World War. If you look at the weapon treaties, that was done in the midst of the Cold War. If you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we're the custodian of that, that was done in 1989. It's the most ratified human rights convention in the world. Because even in the Cold War, states choose collaboration over fragmentation and competition. And I know that in a forum like this, we often see cooperation as naive, idealistic, the do-gooders. But of course, this is the conveyor belt to much of human progress, and we know that. I mean, we are dependent. You were talking, Corentin, on financial streams. We depend on each other, whether we like it or not. From trade to terrorism, we are connected. From social media to migration, we are connected. From communicable diseases, look at the Ebola case we had here in France. Look at polio. Look at climate change. We are connected. That's just a political fact. And so we can choose to close our eyes for that. And all of us will suffer, but children will suffer most. Because for them, multilateralism is not what I hear here. It's not an ideology for children. For children, it is the difference very often between living or not having the chance to survive. For children, it is that invisible hand. It's not, you know, those guys or girls in the pinstripe suits in the August halls in the UN. It is the vaccine that reaches that remote village. It is the ceasefire that we broker so that we can actually get behind the front line to deliver humanitarian goods. It is those treaties that we sign together to protect girls from trafficking, from abuse. That is what multilateralism really means. And perhaps my last word I want to say is that I think in times like these, when fragmentation becomes the norm and cooperation is still seen as the weakest part, we have shown as a world that we do not have to be pessimistic. We have shown as a world in times of turmoil that we can actually get together. Even in a time like Ukraine crisis, we got the grain deal to protect Africa. So our plea is to continue to find bridges, to continue to find not where the world divides us, not between the big powers and the small powers, but to look at the small powers, that is children, because those pin-sized citizens of this world really need your protection and your collaboration. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour vos encouragements. Merci beaucoup. Je me retourne à nouveau vers le professeur Wang.
Professor Wang, early on, you wanted to react to Jean Pisani's very words. Now, let me tell you this, if you don't mind. In the US, things are fairly clear-cut. When we go to the US and we talk to US people, China is an opponent. And that's to be contained at best, which has to be fought against in the worst case. In Europe, possibly just as in the US, considered as a predator country. Jean Pisani mentioned the surpluses and support of China to Russia, so in the Ukraine war. So I'd like to give you the floor, sir. What is the role of China and the vision that other countries may have in the Western world about the China, which could be maybe a more complex vision and which sometimes have a negative note?
Yes, I think those are great questions. First of all, I would like to say what you said, the US wants to treat China as a rivalry and contain China. That's totally wrong. You know, China represents about 20% global population, and China lifted 800 million people out of poverty. China contributed 30% of global GDP growth. And China is the largest trading nation with 140 countries. So China does bring good benefits to the world. So that's not right to contain that. But I think, the US also, particularly, I think, since the second term of Trump, they realized China is, also a constructive strategic stability. They want to maintain that now. So there's a shift from the Trump 1 strategic rivalry to now Trump 2, the strategic stability. So that's number one. Number 4, for Professor, just mentioned about China, you know, there's a lot of course, we understand there's a lot of complaints about China. They talk about rare earths and things like that. But let's not forget, who weaponized first? You know, we should not weaponize technology. We should not weaponize chips. We should not weaponize, you know, like XML of Netherlands, the equipment, chip-making equipment selling to China. We should, you know, China has 2,000 companies on the sanction list by the US. Probably there's another, you know, 100, 200 sanctions list on the European list. So they are weaponized first. China responded with some measures, of course. I mean, China is already resilient enough, they can still, that's what the, you know, Hank Paulson recently spoke at my event saying, you know, they have, China has achieved a reciprocal, mutually assured disruption. So now they realize US is also European, you know, in order to sanction China, contain China, is going to hurt himself. So I think that there's a trend that people has to be realistic now, not to do that. And also, there's complaining about China overcapacity and things like that. You know, actually, Airbus, 70% of Airbus was sold outside Europe. Nobody talk about overcapacity. You know, German, you got 8 million German car manufactured, 6, 7 million sold outside Germany. Nobody talk about overcapacity. And you talk about Japan, you know, again, 8 million cars, over half of them sell overseas. Nobody talk about overcapacity. But China, EV car, they have a 30 million produced. They sell about 6, 7 million outside China. It's less than, you know, 20%. And then out of the 20% are made by multinationals, by Tesla, BMW, and other international companies. So I think we have to see that. You know, objectively on those issues. But China likes to invest. China likes to invest in Europe, in US, in Latin America, but it was not allowed to sometimes. They were restricted to do that. So we would like to invest more technology, capital, creating jobs, you know, generated tax revenues. So what I think we should do, that's my recommendation now. We should get rid of geopolitical globalization. We should really pursue economic, functionary globalization. Let's get all the working together on the climate change, working together for the global health, working together for the global development, working together to get rid of global debt. You know, forget about the geopolitical rivalry, and that's not a health. So I think US is already abandoned the rivalry, you know, mentality, at least from the White House. Why not the European Union abandon the rivalry too? Because right now the European policy towards China is a competitor, rivalry, and collaborator. Let's put the cooperation first, you know, rather than a rivalry at the beginning. So finally, I would like to say China is really doing a lot of good things. Somebody talk about AI. You know, I think China was also the first country to say no nuclear use to Russia, to Ukraine. President Xi told Olaf Scholz, no nuclear weapons should be fought for Russia at Ukraine. That's a strong stand. I think also China's support not to close Hormuz Channel. We should open Hormuz Channel, have a peace and dialogue. Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke with almost 40 foreign ministers behind the scene, promoting the peace for Iran and the war going on. So I think that why not we all say in the future, let's not weaponize anything we are using. For example, can we say we're not going to be the first user of the AI? China said it's not going to be the first user of nuclear power. Can US, France, UK, India, Pakistan all say the same? Let's not first use the nuclear weapons. Let's not weaponize anything we have. Let's promote peace and prosperity. That's, I think, the new functional globalization we need. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Pour rebondir sur ce que vous venez de dire, je voulais juste...
To close on what you've just said, let me ask one last question. A lot of people, in my opinion, here in Aix-en-Provence, and especially leaders, managers who talk about technology transfer 20, 25 years ago. China was against the opening of its market, imposed to us, Europeans and others, technology transfers. And therefore, it was able to catch up on its, the fact it was lagging in some domains, and now it is leading. So, should there be technological transfer from China to the rest of the world? Accessible to the European market, for example.
Absolutely. I think it's really great. I think all the multinational, even the European Union and German Chamber of Commerce have done surveys. Most companies still want to do business in China. They keep their investment. McKinsey, chairman of China, recently wrote a book calling China is the best fitness room, best training room for all the multinationals. So if you can conquer China market, if you can sell to the 1.4 billion people, you can sell to the world. So that's the state of our technology on the EV, on the climate change, on everything. So I think that China definitely would like to do the investment, technology transfer, if we have a good political environment. You cannot bash in China at the one time and ask China to do the, why don't you give me this and that? So I think we need to really have a good relation, trust. Let's build up the trust first, and then we can always do good business. And like China is doing for all ASEAN countries, with Latin American countries, African countries. China is the only country in the world that announced that China is going to exempt tariff, zero tariff, for 53 African countries. No country is doing that. China is doing that. So I think there's many things China can do for Europe and for, Western countries, including the global South.
Merci. Comme Corentine Poilvet,
Comme Florentine said early on, we are in a world where interdependencies are known, and the major states which control major leverage or bottlenecks do no longer hesitate to use them to serve their geopolitical intentions. Clearly, critical metals or ores, rare earths. In the last AI from the Anthropic, which was blocked by the US, for everywhere, in China and Hong Kong. But I have a collective question here. What are the leverage controlled by Europe today, which are equal in footing and which it could use within a framework of tension versus the US or China? We in Europe, do we have something that we could use to leverage or balance, similar to Metal 5 or critical metals or rare earths? Jean Pisani-Ferry. That's a tricky question, I'd grant you. Well, it is a tricky question, but the answer we can give is that we got ASML, the company which has the monopoly of the design of chips, and it is a global monopoly de facto, and we don't use it. So clearly, we can use it too. So I come out of this discussion more worried than I was when I joined, because I think when I came in, I sat down here, I thought that we could find modes of discussion, sort of rules of agreements, and now I realize, in fact, that we do not measure the efficiency cost of rivalries and the efficiency cost of the weaponization of whatever. So, and this is dangerous, because the day we tilt, and then it will be difficult to pull out of it. History shows us that, teaches us that it's very difficult to pull out of such a bad situation. Anybody else to reflect? Raphael Torchman? Well, simply, the major asset we have is that we are 550 million or 450 million users or population. Just that is an asset, and when we look at the projections in as the birth rate drop even in China, there is just as many in vitro fecundation in China than in the rest of the world, because they do the best to increase the birth rate, it is a major issue in China, and the number of births. So between I think 2000, between now and 2100. In China, if nothing is done, you will be 450 million inhabitants, which is this is this is something to be leveraged. But I think the US democracy has got 1.4 billion Indians, so I don't know if, well, quarantine. Well, we talked about it. The only thing that counts is access to markets, which is what you said, access to markets, to have very strategic intentionalities of where we enter the value chain, including AI. We didn't talk about it, but the true issue of AI is not application, it's infrastructures. So it's energy policies at the end. And the mixity of European Union energy policy is very interesting. But we have to grab one topic, and we all out, which is access to the cloud. Only 15% of the European Union companies use the cloud. On average, if we simplify, no cloud, no AI. And they use a cloud, which is a US cloud, and they use a US cloud mostly, yes, because there is no cloud, pan-European cloud standard, authorized by companies. So AI, cloud, energy policies, lots of ambition on AI, good energy policy, but we're late about the cloud, so we cannot differentiate the two elements, and we have to control the market. Kitty van der Eggen, how do you see the leads for improvement for cooperation despite this bleak landscape?
$1 million question. Look, I don't think it's going to be easy, but as I said, history has taught us that we can always find a way forward when you unite with what brings you together as humanity. And whether we like it or not, we are independent. So if we are not able to vaccinate children, diseases are going to travel and end up in your doorstep, and it will disrupt your business. We've seen that with COVID. And many of you will be parents here. What do you do when your child does not have access to education, to healthcare? You walk. So the despair that follows when we're unable to reach children, that fuels instability, displacement, that is going to ripple outwards. And what I want you to retain today is that, the more fragile a children's life becomes, the more fragile the world becomes. And that is worthy the investment of all of us, whether you're in trade, whether you're in finance, whether you're in pharma, or whether you're an individual, because we know it can be done. Thank you.
Je voudrais tous vous remercier.
Thank you very much to all five of you. This has been a really interesting panel discussion. We perhaps need to put things into practice. So next year, maybe we'll need to come back with some better news about a world that's cooperating a bit better than this year, a bit of a less fragmented world.